The story of Viking presence in England has its first major development in 793, when a group of Vikings sailed from Scandinavia to raid the monastery at Lindisfarne. They looted its treasures, slaughtered the monks, and desecrated Christian symbols. Anglo-Saxons, the guys who were running large parts of England at this time, quickly branded the Vikings as the ultimate enemies, likening them to wolves prowling around at night. But were the Vikings really so different from them? Let's bust the first myth. The Vikings were not a single cultural or ethnic group. The word Viking, particularly in its original form as Vikinger, was more of a job description. In the 8th century, most Vikings were young men from Scandinavia, looking to raid, plunder, and build enough wealth to buy a farm and settle down. Now consider who was in charge of England at this time: the Anglo-Saxons, who are Germanic tribes that had invaded in the 5th century, displacing the native Celtic inhabitants. These Anglo-Saxons came from North Germany and Denmark, so basically the same exact places that the Vikings originated from. Culturally, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings were just a few hundred years apart. Old Norse speakers could likely understand Old English speakers fairly well, and Anglo-Saxon kings even claimed descent from a number of Norse gods, such as Thor, even after converting to Christianity. While Lindisfarne marked the first major Viking raid in England, it wasn't the first time pagan Scandinavians had set foot there, nor was it likely the first Viking raid in general. In fact, a contemporary commentator even blamed the Lindisfarne monks for their own deaths, noting they had adopted pagan, so Scandinavian, haircuts, a sign of how deeply Northern European influences had permeated England long before the Viking raids really got going. Why did the Vikings choose 793 as the year to start raiding England? While there were of course multiple long-term factors involved, such as technological advancements and demographic shifts in Scandinavia, a more immediate trigger might have been the rise of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was building the largest and most powerful realm in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, and he was on a mission to spread Christianity, which for him meant crushing pagan skulls. He suppressed pagan practices, destroying sacred sites like the Irminsul in 772, and even executing over 4,000 pagans at the river Verdun in 782. Scandinavians, feeling threatened by Charlemagne's expansion, likely tried to find a way to strike back, but his empire was too powerful, so instead they settled on a much more vulnerable target: England. After the fall of the Roman Empire, England had fragmented into small, relatively weak kingdoms. The country's geography made it an ideal target for Viking raids. Its numerous monasteries, filled with wealth but largely unprotected, were easy pickings. The countless navigable rivers and long coastline provided perfect routes for the Vikings' swift, ship-based attacks. Over the next 50 years, Viking raids on England continued, growing in intensity and ambition. By 836, they felt bold enough to engage in a major battle with the forces of Wessex at Carhampton, which they won. 2 years later, they entered into an alliance with the Celts of Cornwall against Wessex, though that conflict ended in a stalemate. The real game changer came in 850, when the Vikings decided to stay for winter for the first time, which could only mean more bad news for the Anglo-Saxons. 865 was a particularly dark year for the Anglo-Saxons, as it heralded the arrival of the great Heathen army. According to Norse sagas, this invasion was an act of revenge. King Alla of Northumbria allegedly killed a legendary warrior by the name of Ragnar Lodbrok, and his sons sought vengeance. While Ragnar himself may have been a legendary figure, his sons were definitely real, and their invasion marked a turning point in English history. Thousands of Vikings landed in East Anglia and quickly surged north to Northumbria, where they killed Alla and took control of York. In 870, they returned to East Anglia, where they captured and killed King Eadmund, who was later canonized as Saint Edmund. By 874, the Great Heathen Army had overrun Mercia, taking Repton and driving King Burgred from his kingdom. Only Wessex was left standing. How exactly had the Vikings managed all this in just 9 years? Well, for one, their previous raids had destabilized the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. More importantly, the Anglo-Saxons simply had no answer to the Viking tactics. Vikings lived off the loot they gathered as they moved through England, allowing them essentially to campaign year-round. In contrast, Anglo-Saxon armies were made up of part-time soldiers, most of whom had to go home to take part in the harvest. Anglo-Saxons could and did win battles, especially when they had an army ready, like Wessex did at Ashdown in 872, but they struggled to mount a sustained defense against the Viking onslaught. Wessex nearly collapsed under the Viking pressure. A warlord named Guthrum, who had recently arrived from Scandinavia with a fresh army, teamed up with Ubba, one of Ragnar Lodbrok's supposed sons, to put an end to Wessex. They attacked King Alfred's estate at Chippenham just after New Year's, catching the kingdom off guard while most of the nobility and army were still celebrating the festive season. Many were killed, and Alfred was forced to flee to the island of Athelney, where he spent months in exile. But Alfred wasn't beaten, and there were still plenty in Wessex still loyal to him. In May 878, he returned with an army raised from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, and defeated Guthrum's forces at the Battle of Edington. Guthrum was forced to surrender, with the terms of his capitulation being most peculiar. The treaties signed between Alfred and Guthrum are often taken to be the foundation of the Danelaw, the Scandinavian-controlled region of England. However, since the Danelaw never existed as a single political entity, a more correct reading of the situation might be that these treaties were actually laying the groundwork for the creation of England. The agreements defined the border of Wessex, which now included large parts of former Mercia. Guthrum was allowed to remain king in East Anglia, but only if he converted to Christianity, which he did, taking on the name Aethelstan. His godfather, none other than King Alfred. So within a few months, Alfred had turned the situation around completely, extending his influence into 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He must have felt secure in his position as he took to calling himself king of the Anglo-Saxons from 886 onwards. So what was life like in this emerging England? Unsurprisingly, on both sides of the Anglo-Scandinavian border, life was quite similar. Despite the horror stories of Viking raids, Anglo-Saxon culture wasn't all that different. Before the Vikings arrived, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms often raided each other for wealth and slaves, just as the Vikings did. When the Viking leaders started settling in as rulers of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, they were eager to emphasize continuity with the local traditions. In Northumbria, pagan warlords sought the blessing of the local Catholic archbishop to solidify their power, and they got it. Before long, they were even issuing coins with the image of Saint Eadmund, the very king they had killed less than a generation ago, to demonstrate their newfound Christian piety. More curiously, sometimes pagan and Christian themes were blended together. There is an artifact called the Thorwalds cross, which was decorated with both a drawing of Odin battling the apocalyptic wolf Fenrir and Christ triumphing over Satan. That said, some cultural differences definitely persisted. The Vikings continued their tradition of elaborate furnished burials, at least for a while, and Viking farmers likely enjoyed a slightly higher status than their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. Women too enjoyed a more prominent role in Viking society. The Viking Age would not have been possible without certain ship-related innovations, such as waterproof fabric for sails, which would have been created by women. Norse women maintained control of their belongings and could leave a marriage with their property intact. Some of them rose to positions of prominence all on their own, like the woman found buried with weapons in Birka, Sweden. On both sides of the border, towns were starting to grow, which, shockingly, would have major consequences down the line. In Wessex, Alfred worked to protect his realm from future Viking attacks. He laid out a plan for constructing fortresses all across Wessex, manned by a standing army and connected by a network of roads. These fortresses, often built around former Roman towns, sparked urbanization. At sea, Alfred built a powerful navy to deter Viking fleets. Meanwhile, in the Viking-controlled regions, urbanization came from economic growth. driven by access to Viking trade networks that stretched from the Mediterranean to Asia. Viking influence is still visible in English place names today. Take Lowestoft, which comes from the Norse name Hlothr and the Norse term toft, meaning homestead. Other words also entered and remained in the English language, and the Vikings also introduced the concept of a thing to England. A thing being an early version of a parliament, of course. Tensions between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons escalated around the year 900. After Alfred's death, his successors, Edward and Athelflaed, sought to build on his achievements. The fortress system had successfully defended Wessex from Viking attacks, allowing them to push forward and conquer East Anglia and Mercia by 920. However, their expansion into Northumbria faced complications due to changes within the Viking ranks. The more assimilated Viking rulers in Northumbria were displaced by newcomers from Dublin. These Vikings, expelled from Ireland by the Irish in 902, retained a more traditional Scandinavian culture and believed in raiding the Anglo-Saxons rather than coexisting. Unfortunately for them, they lacked the military strength to support their ambitions, and in 927 the next Anglo-Saxon king, Aethelstan, captured York and took control of Northumbria. Aethelstan then declared himself King of the English, becoming the first person to use that title. His grip over Northumbria was not very secure, and Vikings regained power periodically until 954, when Aethelstan's nephew Edgar kicked Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king, out of York. Edgar was about as good a king as you could hope for in this time. He gave the Scandinavians autonomy to live under their own laws within the English kingdom, and even executed Anglo-Saxons who had tried attacking Scandinavian traders. The order of the day was peace and coexistence, supported by a massive fleet to scare off any Vikings still prowling around. Unfortunately, he had to die at some point, and his successor, Athelred, was literally known as Athelred the Unready, which tells you everything you need to know. Unable to efficiently make use of the military structures created by his ancestors, he resorted to paying the Vikings to go away. The first payment in 991 was manageable at £10,000, but this strategy only invited further attacks. So by 1016, the payments had gotten as large as £72,000, which would have required the collection of over 17 million silver pennies. The context of this last payment is crucial. On November 13th, 1002, under pressure to address renewed Viking raids, Athelred made a disastrous decision. He ordered the killing of all Scandinavians in England. While it would have been impossible to fully carry out the order, many massacres still occurred. One of the victims was Gunhild, sister of Svein Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. In retaliation, Svein launched several major raids on England before deciding to conquer the country outright, which he did in 1013. The height of Scandinavian influence, however, came under his son, Cnut. I increasingly refer to Scandinavian rather than Viking influence because the Viking way of life was fading. Cnut may be regarded as the greatest Viking of all time because he built an empire that stretched across England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. But by the early 11th century, the world had changed. Instead of pagan tribes conducting small-scale raids across the seas, Christian kings were playing politics against each other. While Norse was still spoken at Cnut's court in Winchester, and Scandinavian styles influenced art, clothing, and architecture across England, the pagan, seafaring spirit had evaporated, both on the British Isles and back home in Scandinavia. Instead, Cnut emphasized continuity with the Anglo-Saxon dynasties that preceded him. His own dynasty fell apart pretty quickly after his death in 1035, and England returned to Wessex rule, however briefly. By 1066, the throne was held by Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. Harold's hold on the throne was shaky, with two other claimants emerging. Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, was the last Scandinavian contender, but he was defeated at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The other claimant, William the Conqueror, also had a distinctly Viking ancestry. William was a Norman, and Normans were essentially the product of a cultural fusion between Vikings and the French. following a similar pattern of raiding and conquest. And it was William who defeated the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, Harold Godwinson, on October 14th at the Battle of Hastings. So, did the Viking Age end in 954 with the death of Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking ruler of Northumbria? Or was it on the 25th of September, 1066, when Harald Hardrada was slain? Or was it an Anglo-Scandinavian age that ended with Harold Godwinson a few weeks later? Or maybe the Viking influence persisted in England, enduring in the blood of Norman conquerors, in the landscapes of English towns, fields, rivers, hills, coasts, and fens, and possibly even in the cultural subconscious of the people who would call England their home over the next 1,000 years. The only one who can answer that question is you, dear viewer, in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Check out some of my shorts if you want more Viking content. This has been Ivan with Retrospect History, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.